At dawn on June 22, 1941, the guns opened across a front that stretched for thousands of kilometers. The invasion, Operation Barbarossa, began with a level of speed and coordination the world had never seen. Entire Soviet armies were encircled within days. Airfields burned before planes could even take off. Columns of prisoners marched west in numbers so vast that German soldiers began to believe the war had already been decided. To many in the German high command, this was not just a victory, it was confirmation. Everything they had assumed about the Soviet Union seemed to be true. A state they considered weak, disorganized, and hollow was collapsing exactly as predicted. Reports flowed in describing hundreds of thousands of captured troops, destroyed tanks, shattered divisions. Maps were redrawn daily as German spearheads advanced deeper into Soviet territory. It appeared unstoppable. Inside headquarters, officers spoke openly about timelines. Weeks, not months. The Soviet Union, they believed, could not survive such losses. One more push, just one more, and it would all come crashing down. The war in the East would be over before winter. Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff, recorded his impressions carefully in his diary. At first, his tone reflected the same confidence shared by many around him. Soviet resistance was collapsing faster than expected. Entire fronts were disintegrating. The numbers seemed to confirm it. Millions of Soviet soldiers either captured, killed, or scattered. From a purely military standpoint, it looked like annihilation. But numbers can deceive. What Halder and others did not yet understand was that they were measuring destruction, but not capacity. They were counting what had been lost, not what still remained. And in that difference lay the beginning of a fatal misunderstanding. German intelligence, led in part by officers like Reinhard Gehlen, had built its pre-war assessments on incomplete and often flawed data. Estimates of Soviet manpower reserves were far too low. Industrial output had been underestimated. The sheer scale of the Soviet system, its ability to absorb catastrophic losses and continue functioning, was something the Germans had never fully grasped. In the early weeks, this didn't matter. Success was so overwhelming that doubts had no space to grow. Entire Soviet formations vanished under the weight of encirclement battles at places like Minsk and Smolensk. German officers began to use a particular phrase: "The enemy is finished." And yet, quietly, something strange began to appear in the reports. Units that had been listed as destroyed began to reappear. At first, it was dismissed as confusion. Perhaps remnants had escaped. Perhaps reports had been exaggerated. In the chaos of such massive operations, errors were expected. But then it happened again and again. Entire divisions, supposedly wiped out, were being identified on the front lines once more. Not broken remnants, but reorganized units, sometimes with fresh equipment. New formations appeared where none should exist. The Red Army, which by all logic should have been collapsing, was still fighting, and in some sectors fighting harder. For German commanders, this was deeply unsettling. War, as they understood it, followed certain rules. Destroy an army, and it is gone. Break a nation's military, and resistance collapses. That was the model they had seen in Poland, in France, across Western Europe. But this was different. The Soviet Union did not behave like a defeated enemy. Even as German forces pushed forward, they encountered stubborn resistance in unexpected places. Defensive lines reformed behind shattered fronts. Fresh troops appeared in sectors that had already been cleared. The deeper the Germans advanced, the less predictable the battlefield became. Halder's diary entries began to shift in tone. Confidence gave way to questions.
The assumption of imminent victory started to crack, not suddenly, but gradually, almost imperceptibly. There was no single moment of realization. Instead, there was a growing unease. How could an enemy suffer such losses and still continue to fight? The answer, though not yet fully understood, lay far beyond the battlefield. It lay in the vastness of the Soviet Union itself, in its population, its industry, its ability to mobilize resources on a scale that defied German expectations. But in 1941, this reality was still hidden behind the illusion of victory. German soldiers at the front could not see it. They saw only what was in front of them: destroyed tanks, abandoned equipment, endless columns of prisoners. To them, victory felt not just possible, but inevitable. And yet, with every kilometer they advanced, the war was quietly changing. The distances grew longer. Supply lines stretched thinner. Resistance, though battered, refused to disappear. The idea of a quick campaign began to clash with the reality of a vast, unbroken enemy. Still, the belief persisted. One more push. It became almost a mantra. One more offensive, one more encirclement, one more decisive blow, and the Soviet Union would finally collapse. Plans were drawn, revised, and accelerated. There was no room for doubt at the highest levels, especially under the watchful eye of Adolf Hitler, who remained convinced that the enemy was already on the brink of destruction. But reality does not bend to belief. By late summer, the signs were impossible to ignore. The Red Army was not disappearing, it was regenerating. Not perfectly, not without chaos or loss, but with a persistence that defied every expectation. The Germans had destroyed armies, but not the system that created them, and that distinction would prove decisive. What seemed in June like the beginning of a swift and final victory was in truth the opening act of something far more dangerous. A war of endurance against an enemy that could replace its losses faster than Germany could inflict them. The illusion held for a time. It allowed the German High Command to continue forward, to commit deeper, to believe that success was just beyond reach. But beneath that illusion, the foundations of their strategy were already beginning to crumble. Because the Soviet Union was not finished. It was only beginning to reveal what it was truly capable of.
Winter came early in 1941, and with it came a change that German commanders had not anticipated, not just in weather, but in the nature of the war itself. The advance toward Moscow slowed, then stalled, and then something far more troubling began to unfold. The enemy that had seemed on the verge of collapse was not only still standing, it was preparing to strike back. In the forests and frozen roads before Moscow, German units began encountering resistance that felt different. It was no longer the disorganized, desperate defense of the summer months. Soviet formations were appearing with greater coordination, better timing, and a growing sense of purpose. Reports from the front spoke of fresh troops, well-equipped and determined, arriving in sectors that German intelligence had already marked as exhausted. For officers studying the situation, the implications were deeply unsettling. Among those tasked with understanding the enemy was Reinhard Gehlen. His role was to analyze Soviet capabilities, to measure what remained after the devastating losses of 1941. But the data he was receiving did not align with any previous assumptions. According to every model, the Red Army should have been nearing total collapse. Instead, it was growing. Gehlen's reports began to describe a phenomenon that was difficult to explain. Soviet units were reappearing after being destroyed. Entire formations, previously encircled and eliminated, were showing up again on the battlefield. Not as scattered survivors, but as reorganized divisions, sometimes with new equipment, sometimes with new commanders, but unmistakably present. At first,
These reports were met with skepticism. German commanders had confidence in their own assessments. After all, they had witnessed the destruction firsthand: massive encirclements, overwhelming victories, undeniable results. How could those same units exist again? The answer, though increasingly clear, was difficult to accept. The Soviet Union was not fighting with a single army. It was drawing from a vast reserve of manpower and resources that had been underestimated from the very beginning. What the Germans believed to be the destruction of the Red Army was in reality the destruction of only part of it. As temperatures dropped and the ground froze solid, the Red Army launched its counteroffensive near Moscow. It was sudden, powerful, and, to many German units, completely unexpected. Siberian divisions, fresh, trained for winter conditions, struck against exhausted German troops who were unprepared for prolonged combat in such extreme cold. The myth of Soviet collapse began to break. For Franz Halder, the shift was visible in the reports crossing his desk. The tone had changed. Gone was the certainty of imminent victory. In its place was a growing concern, a realization that the situation was no longer following the expected course. The numbers no longer made sense. German forces had inflicted catastrophic losses, millions of casualties, thousands of tanks destroyed, vast territories captured, and yet the Red Army continued to field new units, continued to resist, continued to fight. This was not supposed to be possible. German military doctrine was built on the idea of decisive battles, encirclements that would destroy the enemy's ability to wage war. It had worked in Poland, it had worked in France, but in the Soviet Union, the same strategy was producing a different outcome. Victory, it seemed, was not cumulative. Destroying Soviet forces did not bring Germany closer to victory in the way it had in previous campaigns. Instead, it revealed something far more dangerous: the enemy's capacity to absorb losses and continue fighting. Galen's intelligence summaries began increasingly urgent. He warned that Soviet reserves were far greater than previously estimated. New armies were being formed behind the front lines. Industrial production, though disrupted, had not collapsed. The Soviet system was adapting, imperfectly but effectively. But intelligence, no matter how accurate, is only valuable as the willingness to accept it. At the highest levels of command, there was resistance to these conclusions. Adolf Hitler remained convinced that the Soviet Union was nearing its end. Reports that contradicted this belief were often dismissed or minimized. The idea that the enemy could recover from such losses was seen not as a reality, but as an exaggeration. This created a dangerous gap between perception and reality. On the ground, German officers were beginning to sense that something fundamental had changed. The war was no longer a rapid advance toward a collapsing enemy. It was becoming a struggle against a force that refused to break. The winter of 1941-1942 exposed this truth with brutal clarity. German troops, unprepared for the conditions, suffered as much from the cold as from the enemy. Equipment failed, supply lines faltered, morale began to erode, and all the while, the Red Army pressed forward, exploiting weaknesses, launching attacks, and demonstrating a resilience that few had anticipated. The phrase "the enemy is finished" began to disappear from reports. In its place came more cautious language: uncertainty, concern, even doubt. The realization was not yet complete, but it was taking shape. The Soviet Union was not defeated in 1941, and the war would not end quickly. Perhaps most alarming of all was the pattern that had become impossible to ignore. Every time German forces destroyed a Soviet formation, another seemed to take its place. It was as if the Red Army could regenerate, drawing strength from a source the Germans could not see. And in many ways, that was exactly what was happening. Beyond the front lines, deep within Soviet territory, a massive effort was underway, one that German intelligence was only beginning to understand. Factories were being relocated, production was being restored, and new armies were being assembled. The war was being rebuilt as it was being fought. For the German High Command, this posed a question they were not prepared to answer. What if the enemy could not be destroyed? What if every victory, no matter how large, only delayed an outcome that was becoming increasingly inevitable? By early 1942, the illusion of easy victory had begun to fade. Not completely. Hope and confidence still remained, but the first cracks were visible. The idea of a short war had been replaced by something far more troubling: the possibility of a long, exhausting conflict against an opponent whose strength was not diminishing but growing. The ghost armies of the Red Army were no longer just a mystery. They were a warning that the war Germany thought it was winning might in fact only just be beginning.
What the German army was facing at the front in early 1942 could not be fully understood from the battlefield alone. The reports of new Soviet units, the steady reappearance of formations, the growing number of tanks and artillery, all of it pointed to a deeper reality. The Red Army was not simply surviving, it was being rebuilt. To understand how, one had to look far beyond the front lines into the vast interior of the Soviet Union. In the chaotic first months of the war, as German forces advanced rapidly eastward during Operation Barbarossa, Soviet leadership made a decision that would shape the entire course of the conflict. Rather than allow their industrial base to be captured or destroyed, they would move it. Entire factories, machines, equipment, raw materials were dismantled piece by piece. Workers, engineers, and their families were loaded onto trains and sent east beyond the reach of German bombers and advancing armies. The scale of this operation was enormous. Thousands of industrial facilities were relocated across the Ural Mountains, into Siberia, into Central Asia. To German planners, such an undertaking seemed almost impossible. The expectation had been that Soviet industry, concentrated in the western regions, would be quickly overrun and rendered useless. Without it, the Red Army would collapse. That had been the assumption. But the assumption was wrong. What followed was not the destruction of Soviet industry, but its transformation. In distant cities, under extreme conditions, factories were reassembled, often in open fields, sometimes without proper buildings, sometimes in freezing temperatures. Production resumed with urgency and desperation. Workers labored long hours with minimal resources, driven by the knowledge that the survival of their country depended on it. And within months, the results began to appear at the front. German soldiers started encountering increasing numbers of Soviet tanks, not the outdated models they had faced in 1941, but newer, more effective designs. Among them was the T-34, a machine that had already surprised German forces during the initial invasion. Now it was appearing in greater numbers. The T-34 was not perfect, but it had qualities that made it formidable. Its sloped armor provided better protection. Its wide tracks allowed it to move more effectively over mud and snow. Its gun was capable of challenging many German tanks. Perhaps most importantly, it could be produced in large quantities. For German commanders, this was a troubling development. The expectation had been that Soviet equipment would decline in both quality and quantity as the war progressed. Instead, they were facing an enemy that was improving its tools of war while simultaneously increasing their numbers. Reports from intelligence officers like Reinhard Gehlen began to reflect this shift. The data suggested that Soviet industrial output had not only recovered, it was accelerating. Tank production, artillery production, ammunition supply, all were rising at a pace that German planners had not anticipated. This raised a critical question. How could an economy under such pressure, having lost so much territory, still produce so much? The answer lay in the structure of the Soviet system. Unlike Germany, which relied on a more complex and often fragmented industrial network, the Soviet Union had the ability to centralize its efforts. Resources were directed where they were needed most.
Civilian consumption was sacrificed. Everything was subordinated to the war effort. It was not efficient in the conventional sense, but it was effective. Meanwhile, Germany faced its own limitations. The war had been planned as a short campaign. Industrial mobilization had not been fully aligned for a prolonged conflict of attrition. As the war dragged on, the strain began to show. Production increased, but not at the rate required to maintain a decisive advantage, especially against an enemy that was rapidly closing the gap. At the front, this imbalance became increasingly visible. German units reported encountering more tanks, more artillery, more resistance. Battles that had once been swift and decisive were becoming longer and more costly. The idea that the Soviet Union was running out of resources no longer matched reality. For generals like Franz Halder, the implications were deeply concerning. The war was shifting from one of maneuver to one of production. Victory would no longer be determined solely by tactical brilliance or operational success. It would depend on which side could sustain the fight longer. And in that kind of war, the balance was beginning to tilt. The German strategy had been built on the assumption of quick victory, on the belief that the Soviet Union could be defeated before its full potential was brought to bear. But now that potential was becoming visible. Every destroyed Soviet tank was being replaced. Every lost unit was being rebuilt. The losses that seemed catastrophic in 1941 were being absorbed, not eliminated. And behind it all was an industrial system that, far from collapsing, was adapting and expanding. Perhaps most alarming was the realization that German forces had no direct way to stop it. The relocated factories were beyond the reach of German armies. Strategic bombing capabilities were limited and insufficient to disrupt production on such a vast scale. The very geography of the Soviet Union, its size, its depth, was working in its favor. This created a situation that German planners had not foreseen. They were fighting an enemy whose ability to wage war was increasing over time, not decreasing. The consequences of this realization were profound. If the Soviet Union could continue to produce weapons, to field new armies, to replace its losses indefinitely, then the logic of the campaign itself was called into question. The assumption that time favored Germany was no longer valid. In fact, the opposite might be true. Time was becoming the enemy. Yet even as this understanding began to take shape among some officers, it was not universally accepted. Optimism, or perhaps denial, persisted in parts of the leadership. The belief that one decisive victory could still end the war remained strong. But the evidence was mounting. The Red Army was not only surviving, it was being strengthened by an industrial system that had adapted to the realities of total war. The deeper Germany advanced, the less it could affect that system, and the longer the war continued, the more that system would produce. What had begun as a campaign of rapid conquest was transforming into something far more dangerous, a war of attrition against an opponent with greater resources, greater depth, and a growing capacity to sustain the fight. The factories beyond the Urals were more than just workshops. They were the foundation of a war that Germany was no longer certain it could win.
By 1942, the war on the Eastern Front was no longer defined by the shock and speed of the initial invasion. Something deeper had changed. The Red Army that German forces had encountered in the summer of 1941, disorganized, vulnerable, and often overwhelmed, was not the same army they were facing now. It was learning. At first, this transformation was subtle. German officers began noticing that Soviet defenses were no longer collapsing as easily under pressure. Positions were better prepared. Counterattacks were timed more effectively. Units that once fought in isolation were beginning to coordinate their actions. What had once seemed like chaos was slowly taking on structure. This was not accidental. The Soviet command system, which had suffered heavily during the early stages of the war, was adapting under extreme pressure. Experienced officers were being promoted. Lessons from past failures were being applied. Communication, though still imperfect, was improving.
The Red Army was evolving in real time, shaped by the brutal realities of the conflict. For German commanders, this posed a new kind of threat. They had expected the Soviet Union to weaken over time, not just in numbers but in capability. Instead, they were facing an enemy that was becoming more effective with each passing month. Mistakes that had been exploited in 1941 were no longer as common. Defensive lines held longer. Breakthroughs were harder to achieve. General Hermann Hoth, among others, began to recognize that the character of the war was shifting. The Red Army was no longer simply reacting. It was beginning to anticipate, to plan, to execute operations with increasing competence. Battles became more costly. Where German forces had once advanced rapidly, they now encountered layered defenses, reinforced positions, and determined resistance. Soviet troops, though still suffering heavy losses, were fighting with greater discipline. Retreats were more organized, counteroffensives were more deliberate. The idea of an inferior enemy was becoming harder to maintain. At the same time, the scale of Soviet manpower continued to defy expectations. German intelligence had already begun to revise its estimates, but even the new figures struggled to capture the full reality. The Soviet Union could draw upon millions of additional soldiers. Even after the catastrophic losses of 1941, new armies continued to appear. This constant flow of manpower had a psychological effect on German troops. Every victory seemed incomplete. Every destroyed unit was replaced. The sense of fighting an enemy with endless reserves began to take hold. It was not just a physical challenge, but a mental one. The realization that no matter how much damage was inflicted, the war would continue. And the Red Army was not just replacing its soldiers, it was improving how they fought. Training programs were adjusted, command structures were refined, coordination between infantry, artillery, and armored units became more effective. The Soviets were beginning to conduct operations that showed planning and foresight rather than desperation. This evolution was supported by something else, something that German commanders had not fully accounted for. Material support from outside the Soviet Union was beginning to arrive in significant quantities. Through the program known as Lend-Lease, the United States and its allies provided trucks, food, raw materials, and equipment that helped sustain the Soviet war effort. While this support did not replace Soviet production, it strengthened it. It improved mobility. It eased logistical pressures. It allowed Soviet industry to focus on producing weapons while other needs were met through external supply. For Germany, this added another layer of complexity. The war in the East was no longer an isolated conflict. It was becoming part of a broader global struggle in which the Soviet Union was supported by powerful allies. The longer the war continued, the more this support would grow. Meanwhile, German advantages were beginning to erode. Equipment that had once been superior was now being matched or even surpassed in certain areas. The T-34, produced in increasing numbers, forced German units to adapt their tactics. Encounters with Soviet armor were no longer predictable victories. They were becoming dangerous engagements. At the operational level, German forces faced increasing strain. Supply lines stretched over vast distances. Replacements were harder to obtain. The cumulative effect of continuous fighting began to wear down even the most experienced units. And across the front, the pattern remained consistent. The Red Army was getting stronger. For some German officers, the implications were becoming impossible to ignore. This was no longer a campaign that could be won through a single decisive battle. It was turning into a prolonged struggle against an opponent whose capabilities were expanding. Yet recognition did not always lead to action. At the highest levels of command, there was still reluctance to fully accept the scale of the problem. Adolf Hitler continued to believe that determination and willpower could overcome material disadvantages. Orders emphasized holding ground, pressing forward, refusing to yield. But the reality on the battlefield was more complex. German generals found themselves in a difficult position. They could see the changes, they could read the reports, they understood that the Red Army was no longer the same enemy they had faced at the start of the war, but adjusting strategy required acknowledging that the original assumptions had been wrong, and that was not easily done. So the war continued, with both sides pushing forward, each battle adding to the growing realization that this conflict would not end quickly. The Red Army's transformation was not complete. It still made mistakes, it still suffered enormous losses, but it was no longer the fragile force of 1941. It was becoming something far more resilient, far more capable. An army that could learn, adapt, and endure. And for Germany, that was perhaps the most dangerous development of all, because it meant that the longer the war lasted, the stronger the enemy would become.
By the time the war entered its second year, the signs were no longer isolated or ambiguous. They were everywhere, on the front lines, in intelligence reports, in the quiet conversations between officers who had begun to question what they were fighting against. The Soviet Union had not collapsed, it had endured, and more dangerously, it was growing stronger. For many German generals, this realization came slowly, almost reluctantly. They had built their entire campaign on a set of assumptions that the Red Army would be destroyed in a matter of months, that Soviet industry would collapse under pressure, that the state itself would disintegrate once its military was defeated. These beliefs had justified everything: the scale of the invasion, the risks taken, the confidence in a quick victory. Now, those assumptions were unraveling. Reports from the front told a consistent story. Soviet resistance was not weakening. New formations continued to appear. Equipment losses were being replaced. Battles were becoming longer, harder, more costly. What had once been a war of movement was turning into a war of endurance. Inside the German High Command, the mood began to shift. Officers like Franz Halder had already begun to express concern in their private writings. The optimism of 1941 was gone, replaced by a growing awareness that the situation was far more serious than originally believed. The idea of a quick victory had faded. In its place was an uncomfortable question: what if the war could not be won? Others, including commanders in the field, saw the same pattern. General Hermann Hoth and his peers were facing an enemy that refused to break, an enemy that seemed to absorb every blow and continue fighting. Each offensive demanded more effort, more resources, more time, and delivered less decisive results. Yet acknowledging the full implications of this reality was not simple. At the center of the decision-making process stood Adolf Hitler, whose belief in ultimate victory remained unshaken. He rejected the idea that the Soviet Union could sustain the war indefinitely. Intelligence reports that suggested otherwise were often dismissed or reinterpreted. The possibility of strategic failure was not something he was willing to consider. This created a widening gap between what was being observed and what was being accepted. German intelligence, including the work of Reinhard Gehlen, continued to produce assessments that pointed to a dangerous conclusion. The Soviet Union possessed far greater reserves of manpower and industrial capacity than Germany had anticipated. The longer the war continued, the more these advantages would matter. But these warnings did not translate into a fundamental change in strategy. Instead, Germany found itself locked into a course of action that had been set in motion months earlier. Forces remained committed deep inside Soviet territory. Withdrawal was seen as unacceptable. Every position was to be held, every opportunity for offense pursued. The logic of the initial campaign, rapid victory through relentless pressure, continued to guide decisions, even as the conditions that had made it possible disappeared. This was the beginning of a strategic trap. The German army could not easily disengage, but continuing the fight under the same assumptions only deepened the problem.
Resources were stretched thinner, losses accumulated, the ability to achieve decisive breakthroughs diminished. And all the while, the Soviet Union continued to build strength. Its factories produced more tanks, more artillery, more ammunition. Its armies grew larger, more organized, more capable. Its commanders gained experience. The balance of the war was shifting, not suddenly, but steadily. For some German officers, the realization was clear. Time was no longer on their side. In a short war, Germany had advantages: speed, coordination, tactical superiority. But in a long war, those advantages would fade. The Soviet Union, with its vast resources and capacity for mobilization, would grow stronger with each passing month. What had begun as a race to victory was turning into a test of endurance that Germany was not prepared to win. And yet, this understanding came too late. By the time the full scale of the problem was recognized, the opportunity to change course had already passed. The German army was too deeply committed. The losses of 1941 and early 1942 could not be undone. The strategic initiative, once firmly in German hands, was slipping away. There were moments, brief, fleeting, when alternative paths might have been considered, a shift in priorities, a reconsideration of objectives. But such changes required a willingness to accept that the original plan had failed, and that was something the leadership could not fully embrace. So the war continued, driven forward by momentum as much as by intention. At the front, soldiers fought on, often unaware of the larger strategic reality. They carried out orders, held positions, launched attacks. But behind those actions lay a growing imbalance, one that could not be corrected through courage or determination alone. The Red Army was no longer a force on the brink of collapse. It was an army that had survived its greatest test and emerged stronger, an army supported by an industrial system that could sustain it, by a population that could replenish it, and by a strategic depth that protected it. For Germany, this meant confronting a truth that was as difficult as it was decisive. The war they had expected to win quickly was a war they might not win at all. And by the time that truth was fully understood, it was already too late to change the outcome.